Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. It's my pleasure to be back again, this time bringing you brand new feature of DigitalOcean called monitoring. So in the next half an hour to 45 minutes, I'm going to walk you through the core concepts of monitoring cloud resources, followed by a couple of demos where I'll walk you through the process of setting up monitoring, followed by how do you create alerts and how do you track your resources. So let's get started. So why is it important to monitor cloud deployments? Well, I have been helping many customers move their assets to the cloud. And let me tell you one thing. The most important aspect of cloud deployments is monitoring the resources. So if you have a deployment in the cloud and you're not really tracking and monitoring them, it's almost like being in an aircraft that lost the connection with the ATC. It sounds scary, right? And that's exactly how the deployment would work when you don't have monitoring in it. So it's a proactive mechanism for avoiding disruptions and outages. It's going to help you understand the failures before your customers come back and report. How many times have you felt that the deployment is down, or rather the website is not responding, and you get frustrated because it's not getting fixed and there is no way for you to communicate with the owner of the application? So it leads to customer dissatisfaction, it leads to loss of business, it loses traction, it results in many negative effects, that leaves a very bad taste with the customer. So it's important for developers as well as DevOps to enable monitoring to ensure that their resources are being tracked and they get to know about a failure before their customers experience it. And it is a very, very important aspect. So monitoring averts a possible disaster by letting you take a timely action. If you configure the right triggers, right alerts, and right notifications, you can jump in and quickly fix things before they lose control, before they go out of hand. So it's very, very important. You can also leverage the monitoring and tracking mechanism to automate failover. Though certain cloud providers, including DigitalOcean, they don't support programmatic approach or programmatic mechanism of accessing logs and accessing metrics. I guess that's going to come up in DigitalOcean very soon. But in general, if you have the ability to automate the alerts, notifications, receive them programmatically, you can do a lot. For example, when you get an alert about a possible database failure, it can be completely automated, where a slave database server takes over and makes it a very transparent failover from the primary to secondary or master to slave. So in many cases, you can automate failover, which will ensure business continuity, and you are basically creating a redundant disaster recovery plan. So it's absolutely important to monitor cloud deployments. There are many choices. Currently, if you are deploying applications in the cloud, there are two approaches. The first one is a do-it-yourself approach, which is based on the open source software based on Nagios, which most of you would have voted, and OpsView, which is also a freemium model. You can either run OpsView within your environment, or you can subscribe to their premium SaaS version. But OpsView in its standalone form is pretty useful by itself. There are other tools like Cacti, Asinga, Zabbix, which are very popular in the open source community. But beyond the open source environments, you can also subscribe to more useful, powerful, insightful SaaS tools coming from companies like AppDynamics, Datadog, Boundary, New Relic, SolarWinds. These are some of the examples of SaaS-based monitoring tools. Most of them come with an agent. So all you got to do is deploy an agent in your VM or in your workload, and they start streaming the logs and streaming the information about your cloud resources to remote servers. And they will take over the ability to visualize as well as connect them to other services like PagerDuty or Twilio or SendGrid or any other channel which can send you notifications. So these are some of the choices you have when it comes to monitoring servers in the cloud. When it comes to DigitalOcean, there is a brand new feature. It's one of the most recent additions to the ever-growing list of features in DigitalOcean, and that is the server monitoring feature, which is just a checkbox away. So it delivers insights to administrators. The graphs and the charts are pretty useful, pretty insightful. You can just click a checkbox when you're launching a droplet, and that would enable graphs which will provide up to the minute visualization of key metrics. In fact, even if you don't select the monitoring checkbox, DigitalOcean is able to pull basic metrics about your server utilization, your bandwidth. It cannot really get into the VM and get some important metrics, but it does give you very high level overview of the consumption patterns and the usage patterns of the droplet. Each metric related to CPU or memory or disk can have a predefined threshold. For example, you can say the threshold for CPU could be 70. Memory utilization could be X GB or the capacity based on the droplets configuration. And when the threshold is met, you can configure a notification that's going to be sent to your inbox or Slack. The choices for this will only increase. At this point, the default options are inbox. So basically the account that you use to sign in to DigitalOcean will be used to receive the notifications. You can also authenticate Slack from DigitalOcean, and one of your Slack channels will receive the notification. And as you know, Slack is pretty powerful when it comes to extensibility, and you can automate a lot the moment the notification lands within Slack. But the idea is you either click a checkbox when you're launching a new droplet, or go through a very simple setup process on existing droplets. After that, you can start looking at insightful charts and graphs, and also define slightly complex thresholds, which will cut across multiple metrics, including CPU utilization, memory consumption, disk space availability, bandwidth, both inbound and outbound, and so on. So that brings us to the supported metrics. All you got to know when you're configuring monitoring for DigitalOcean is the metric and the unit of the metric. So what I highlighted here are the supported metrics as well as the units. For example, CPU utilization is a metric, and the unit that you can configure and track is the percentage. Obviously, it makes sense for you to monitor what is the percentage utilization of your CPU, and that can result in a threshold being hit, and which will then translate into a notification arriving into your inbox or to the Slack channel. Memory is measured in terms of percentage of availability of RAM. So again, this is based on the droplet configuration. If you are launching a 1 GB droplet, basically a droplet that supports 1 GB of memory, you can configure a threshold that says when the memory utilization hits 90%, raise a notification. You can also configure disk IO, which is megabyte per second. This basically defines the throughput. So if you are running an OLTP database like MySQL or Postgres, and you have very high disk IO, and if you suspect unusual activity which could result in a disruption or an outage, you can also define a threshold for that. Disk usage is a very important metric. You never want to run out of your disk space. So you can, again, start tracking the disk usage by monitoring the percentage of the total disk space. Thanks to block storage, in case you hit the threshold, you can go ahead and attach another block storage device, which will help you expand the log files or the transaction files, or basically your storage, to an additional disk. Bandwidth is, again, it's going to be available on two different parameters. One is the private network. So if you're familiar with DigitalOcean, you know there are two networks that DigitalOcean supports. One is actually the private shared network, which is going to be available within the networking subnet of DigitalOcean. It is going to be shared across all the customers, but it does give you some kind of a private network that you can use to connect your droplets. Then there is a public network, which is going to be attached to the floating IP or the public IP address of the droplet. You can track the both the inbound traffic, outbound traffic for the private network as well as public network, and you can define some thresholds. For example, if you suspect some kind of malware which is sending a lot of outbound traffic, this is a mechanism for you to track that and immediately kill that process. So you can always measure the bandwidth again in Mbps. You can also take a look at the top processes. This is going to be visible on the portal, so you can sort the percentage of CPU or memory consumption when you are looking at the droplet. So per droplet, you can access the top processes to get a glimpse of what is consuming the max CPU and what is consuming the max memory. They are mutually exclusive, so you have two different options for you to sort them and track them on. So how do you configure monitoring? There are two mechanisms, as I mentioned. The first one is agentless. So an agentless configuration, as the name suggests, is pretty straightforward. By default, every droplet that you have in DigitalOcean supports the agentless monitoring. So it gives you insights into bandwidth consumption of public and private network, and of course CPU activity and the disk IO. Obviously, you cannot get top processes because there is nothing running inside the VM to report some of those metrics. So basically, DigitalOcean monitors at the hypervisor level and filters them on your droplet related metrics and surfaces them at the portal. So you don't need anything to run within the VM to extract these metrics, but they are pretty high level. For example, you don't get metrics like memory usage, you don't get metrics like disk usage and top processes. If you need those granular metrics, then you got to install an agent. And again, installation of an agent can be pretty simple and seamless. When you're launching a droplet, you would have noticed there is a checkbox for monitoring. If you enable that, DigitalOcean automatically injects the agent, configures it, and gets it ready to report the metrics. The other mechanism, which is meant for existing servers, is to run a very simple shell script to basically install the agent. So if you have been running droplets for quite some time, even before the monitoring feature has come up, you can SSH into those droplets, run exactly one command to configure the agent, and it will start participating in the monitoring framework. And all new servers which are going to be launched post the announcement and post the availability of monitoring feature will automatically get the agent when you click that checkbox, which is monitoring. So again, this is, as I mentioned, pretty straightforward mechanism for you to configure. You can click on this, which enables additional droplet metrics for memory consumption, disk space, and top processes. For existing droplets, all you got to do is run this command, which is basically a curl command piped to shell. So this is going to download install.sh and run it locally. The end process and outcome of this command is basically a running agent, which will start sending the metrics to the DigitalOcean monitoring fabric. So once you have them, you can go ahead and configure alerts. So this is how you configure an alert. For example, if CPU is running high, which means 70% of the CPU consumption stays there for at least 5 minutes, you can go ahead and send an alert. And how does it look? So basically, you get an email in your inbox, which looks something like this. So CPU is currently at 100%, above the threshold of 70% for more than 5 minutes. And this is the link for you to access the droplet. And after you take an action, for example, identifying the process or configuring a load balancer and start routing the traffic to another droplet, Once it comes back to the normalcy and stabilizes, you will receive another email, which is going to look like something like this: DigitalOcean monitoring resolved, and the monitor is triggered for 11 minutes 6 seconds. CPU is currently at 52% roughly. So this is an indication that everything is back in action and the CPU load is pretty stable. So that's how you go ahead and configure. Configuring monitoring, I want to go ahead and show you the steps involved in monitoring the droplets in DigitalOcean. So I will take you to the console. So here we have 2 servers, but let me also launch another one, which is going to be called as CS dev. So I will go ahead and launch a new droplet by clicking on create droplet. And again, since I am using DigitalOcean, I can take the liberty of walking you through the process end to end. So it only takes few seconds for me to go ahead and launch a new droplet. So I'm launching an Ubuntu 14.04 with the basic configuration because I want to do some stress test, and it makes it easy if I have less memory and less cores of CPU. So I'm choosing the entry level baseline configuration of 512 MB with 1 CPU. Of course, I choose Bangalore, and I enable monitoring. Pretty straightforward. And I add an SSH key for me to sign in or SSH into my VM. So let me call this CS dev. And if you have been following my demos so far, CS is the cloud shop. So basically, I'm running my dev test production in DigitalOcean. So I go ahead and click on create. So let me make sure I have everything in place. So this is Ubuntu 14.04 with baseline configuration, launched in Bangalore with monitoring enabled. The key here is this. All right, so I go ahead and click on create, and very soon we'll have this up and running. All right, so now I have 3 different droplets running in my environment. Obviously, they correspond to my dev test production workloads. So currently the dev is what is being launched, and I already have the droplets corresponding to test and production in place. But let's actually wait for this to come up, and then I will SSH into this, and we will check out certain capabilities. So I'm going to SSH into my droplet, which we just launched. Let's give it a second. I guess the SSH daemon is just coming up, so it's going to take a while before we can. There we go. All right. So now we have the brand new droplet with monitoring enabled. So how do we know if monitoring is enabled? Well, there is a very simple command. So I can run this command called pgrep do agent xargs ps. So basically, this is going to grab the PID of the agent, which is called the do agent, which is actually an open source agent. The source code is available on GitHub if you're interested. It's a very tiny agent that's installed by default when you click the checkbox. And when you run this, it shows us that it's been running for a while and it's available in this location. So let's go ahead and check this out. So here we have the /opt DigitalOcean. And when we go to the bin folder, we actually see that there is this tiny binary called do agent, and that's currently running, which means this is able to start streaming the metrics to DigitalOcean's console. This is pretty good. So now everything seems to be in place. I also want to kick off something in the background while we are looking at the monitoring metrics. So now we have launched the dev environment and we have enabled monitoring. So we cross-check by looking at pgrep and it reports do agent is up and running. But guess what? I have production that's been running for quite some time and I don't have the agent running. So what happens when you access this? So when you actually click on the droplet, and when you look at the graphs section of the droplet, you notice that you have very few metrics that are being reported. So this is bandwidth public, this is CPU and disk IO. As I mentioned, these are the default metrics that an agentless droplet will start reporting, and this is being tracked at the hypervisor level. So you don't need any special configuration. So let's go ahead and update our production server, which has been running for a while, and this predates the monitoring capability. So how do we configure the agent? Well, I'm going to grab this single command, but before that, let me SSH into my droplet. So this is the IP address, and now we are SSHing into the production box that's been running for a while. So once I get into the droplet, all I got to do is run this command. So let's make sure there is nothing in /opt. So obviously there is nothing because the agent is not running yet. So now I go ahead and run this simple command, which is going to pull install.sh and runs it locally. So it detects the OS and installs the DO agent. Let's give it a minute. And right after this, two things will happen. One, it gets installed and the background process starts. So right after this, when we go back to /opt, we should see DigitalOcean/bin, which will have the binary, which is a DO agent. And when we do a grep, we also notice that the background process is up and running. So once that is done, the console will start showing us additional metrics. Okay, it should be done in just a few seconds. There we go, this is done. So now let's cross check. So when we go to /opt, there is DigitalOcean and there is a bin directory, and there we have the DO agent binary. So pretty straightforward. And when we run the pgrep command, this should report that the DO agent is up and running. Excellent. Now when we come back to the portal, click on graphs and do a refresh, a quick refresh. It should show us that okay, now we have better insights. It all starts with the top processes and CPU metrics with memory metrics. So this is instant. But for the CPU, memory, disk IO, and other metrics, the agent will take some time to send those metrics, and it's going to get ready when the agent is able to stream those metrics. Since we just configured, it's going to take a while. There is no data for the charts to show us what is going on. So I wanted to summarize what we did so far. So the idea is, if you are launching a new droplet, don't forget to click on that checkbox, which is the monitoring checkbox. It doesn't cost you anything. It is absolutely free. So there is no reason why you shouldn't enable monitoring. So this is the key thing. For every server that you're going to launch in DigitalOcean from now, make sure monitoring is enabled. This is very, very important aspect. And for those droplets that have been in production and have been running for a long time and monitoring is not enabled, all you got to do is pull that script, run it, and you don't even need to reboot. It instantly starts streaming the metrics. So that's how you enable monitoring, which is basically the very first step. So it's not very useful just to look at these charts, right? For example, my test server has been running for a while and the agent is also enabled. So let's actually look at the graphs. So it becomes interesting. So here, if you notice, the graph has been fluctuating. It hit almost 100%. It stayed there for a while and then it dropped to almost 0%. And now it is again slowly climbing up and it is somewhere at 55%, right? So it's pretty clear. And you also notice that there is one process that is almost taking 100% of my CPU, which is not a good sign. But guess what? This is actually a kind of a test bed that I created to demonstrate monitoring. So what is going on? So let me show you the test server. I'm running a very trivial command which will spike up the CPU utilization, and that is nothing but dd followed by the input file is /dev0, which feeds unlimited infinite bytes to dd, and I copy that into another device which is null. So anything that goes into null is like a black hole. So nothing really happens if you redirect an output to dev null. So basically I'm getting some dummy input at 500 MB at a time and copying that into another location, which is actually a sinkhole. There is nothing that's going to impact, but this is going to spike up the CPU utilization, and that's the reason why the top processes, it reports that this command is taking almost 100% of the CPU. So this has been running for a while. That's the reason why you notice that it is slowly climbing up. Okay. So now we have 3 different droplets. One is brand new with monitoring enabled. The other one is an existing server with monitoring enabled just now. And we have a server that's been up and running for a while with monitoring enabled and some interesting metrics that we are simulating through the dd command. Okay, so now that we have monitoring enabled for all these droplets, it's time for us to actually do something useful, something meaningful. So when we click on the monitoring option, this is where you can start configuring the alerts. So at this point, we don't have any alerts. So when I click on alert policy, you can define the metric and threshold. So there are just few steps here. For example, you have all the metrics that we discussed. There is CPU, which is measured in the metrics of percentage consumption. There is bandwidth, both inbound and outbound, which is measured in Mbps. There is disk, which is disk IO, measured again in Mbps. Memory utilization, which is in percentage. Disk utilization is again the percentage in terms of available space. So let's now look at the metrics. For example, I want to get notification when the CPU is above 70 and it stays there for at least 5 minutes. There is also another mechanism. For example, I want to track the underutilized droplets and I don't want to pay for them. So if a droplet is performing below 30% utilization, it's a liability for me. It is not really adding much value. Maybe I can move whatever I'm running within the droplet to another droplet and maximize the utilization there. So it's also useful to track the utilization by configuring a metric for the below threshold, right? So that's going to help us get insights into the underutilization of droplets. For now, let's go ahead and configure the higher threshold. So 70% is a good benchmark to give you an indication that something is not right with your droplet. The minimum window that you can track is for 5 minutes. That means if the droplet experiences 70% of spike for at least 5 minutes, you can get notified. So this is where you can identify your droplet. For example, when I type CS test, it automatically shows up. In case you want to monitor a fleet of droplets, for example, I have half a dozen droplets behind a load balancer and I want to monitor all of them because the agent is installed. Guess what? I can actually create a tag and I can just type the tag name and droplets that match the tag name will automatically start participating in this policy, which is pretty cool. This is dynamic and eventually when DigitalOcean supports auto scale, this becomes more and more powerful because you never have to enable monitoring for one server or 2 servers at a time. You can group all of them through a logical tag, and any droplet that matches the tag at that point will start participating in the alert policy. So if a droplet gets removed, it automatically gets disconnected and detached, but a new droplet that comes up with the same tag will automatically join an existing fleet. So it's a very powerful concept. I encourage you to use tags in your production deployments. All right. So Once we have the droplet or the tag identified, you can define an alert. So by default, it takes the email ID of your account. For example, I signed in as this user, so it automatically picks up the same email ID and it's going to send me an alert. And you can give a name. For example, let's call this CS test CPU high. So this will basically create a new alert, and when the condition is met, right? So now I have two policies. Okay, let me get rid of this. We don't need it. Okay, so now we have a very simple alert that we created in the previous step, right? Which is CS test CPU high, and it is applied to the droplet called CS test. What happens when the threshold is met? Now, obviously, I don't want to wait for so long, but this is still running in the background, which means our droplets utilization is almost 100%. So let's cross check that. Okay, so it is consistently 100%, but since the alert is created just now, it will need to wait for 5 minutes before it triggers a notification. But to show you what really happens, I have some cached mails here. So during the previous dry run, I got this this alert. Now CPU is currently at 100% above the threshold for more than 5 minutes. Now this is the IP address, and I can go ahead and check that. Once I take an action and once everything stabilizes and returns to normalcy, I also get another email that says DigitalOcean monitoring resolved. This is the alert name, policy name, and the monitor was triggered for the duration and the current utilization. So this is how you basically receive an alert. So now this is still running at 99.44%, but I don't have any process that is consuming memory. But this is going to be a culprit eventually, which will actually halt my droplet in responding to my users, and it is basically occupying the entire available CPU space. So that pretty much is the workflow involved in configuring monitoring for droplets in DigitalOcean. To summarize, don't forget the option to enable monitoring when you're launching the droplet. For existing droplets, go ahead, run that simple script, and after that you'll get those rich visualizations. And once you have them in place, go ahead and configure your alerts. If you're actually a scripting junkie and you are very comfortable with scripting, you can actually do a lot of automation without DigitalOcean supporting the API. So one of the limitations of the DigitalOcean monitoring at this point, with a disclaimer that it might change in the future, is that there is no API for you to receive the monitoring. At this point, you can only see the output in the graphs that are available here. So if you want to stream them, let's say, to an Elk stack, or you want to create a different dashboard and you want to aggregate the logs, it is not supported at this point. It is all within the portal. But because there is an email that is actually landing in your inbox, you can write a very simple script that will parse an email that looks something like this, and you can immediately take an action. You know, it comes with everything that you need. It has the IP address. That means you can very quickly do a lookup and map to which droplet is responsible for this alert. And you also get the threshold. So it is not very difficult for you to parse. So you parse this alert or the Slack notification, and then call the DigitalOcean API for launching another server, immediately add it to the load balancer, and start routing the traffic to the new droplet. So this is going to be pretty useful to emulate something like an auto scale without DigitalOcean officially supporting it. So the moment you get an email, the opportunities are boundless. You can actually do whatever you want, because you can pass the email subject, the email body, and take a very useful action, which might result in launching a new droplet, adding that to the load balancer, or even killing the droplet because it might be a rogue process that is making it inaccessible. So you can do a lot of things once you start applying the automation capabilities. All right, so that was the walkthrough. Let's come back and get some quick facts about DO monitoring. So there are droplet graphs, which we have seen. It's a visual representation of system level metrics. Alert policies, you can create custom policies that define thresholds for each of the resources or a group of resources that belong to the same tag. You can track metrics that include CPU, memory, disk, bandwidth, and top processes. Pricing is free, which is actually a very, very cool thing. Unlike other providers, you need not pay anything. You won't incur any cost for enabling monitoring. So you should take advantage of this. And unlike other features of DigitalOcean, like block storage, for example, this is available across all regions. So if you're running in any of the supported regions, monitoring is instantly available to you. So there is no reason why you shouldn't go ahead and click the checkbox or install the DO agent to take advantage of the monitoring capability.